Okay, so this presentation is on the 1964 film, A Thousand Clarinets, focusing on the political and social issues that we can see through the film and what it deals with. So, as I said, it was released in 1964, so a bit of background of 1960s Czechoslovakia. This was 15 years after the end of World War II, where now the country is more of a socialist republic. However, this communist kind of regime, what we've seen before, is still very much in control. Still, one of the most powerful in Europe at this time.
Mm-hmm. Can I just interrupt here to explain this thing of the socialist republic? Now, I don't know, I've bored you here with that Marxist theory of development, how basically they all believed, and they basically took it like a religion, that basically there are these economic formations, first primitive society, then feudalism, then capitalism, and then it all develops into communism. And each of these economic formations, the structure of it depends on the level of technological development of what they called means of production. So basically, if you only have a hose and dig the fields, you've got feudalism. If you start developing kind of sort of machinery for factories, you start having capitalism. And in each of these economic formations, you always have antagonistic classes, like, I don't know, the feudal lords and the peasants, whatever. But in capitalism, capitalists and the working classes, and there's always a kind of conflict in between them that becomes ever more intense. And then what they said, quantity turns into quality, and it is a jump into a new economic formation. And this is irrevocable, and they believed it. And they said basically capitalism then turns into communism. But of course, because communism was a total utopia, everybody got everything what they needed, money would be abolished, the state would be abolished and all that. But of course, when they did these communist takeovers in the late 40s, they basically thought, see, we are en route to communism, but of course somehow weirdly the state didn't disappear, it became even stronger. So they said socialism, not the Western style socialism, the communist socialism, is a kind of preparatory stage for this wonderful utopia of communism, right? And in 1960, that President Novotny said, well, look, we've had it for 15 years, and we are an incredibly mature society, and therefore I'm going to call it Czechoslovak Socialist Republic, because we are really getting near to communism. So this is my long sort of rave explanation about your first sentence of your presentation. I do apologize for kind of interfering.
Yeah, so it's just kind of showing that this was a decade of a lot of change happening in a short amount of time. Like this quote was saying, at the beginning in the 1960s, there was nothing really to suggest that Czechoslovakia would become, the home of this communist reform movement that was so significant, just because how strong this communist state still was at the time. As we've seen in previous films as well, the state censorship is still very much active, and it's very strict as well. So where this film comes from as well, the artist, it's turning to satire and irony still to kind of reflect these themes that are still censored. This kind of linked into this, cultural liberation, however, that was emerging through this, because people are getting tired of this kind of censorship, despite this still very, authoritarian regime. Just a couple of quotes here as well that's really showing how this transformation was developing, and what Prague in particular in this quote is saying, how it was transforming from another great Eastern Bloc city into the unofficial capital of cosmopolitan activity. So through this, it's this form of liberation, which we see a lot in this film, kind of transforming it into a very culturally diverse space. And as well, we're talking about the new wave moment in film as well. Cinema is becoming more of an art form, and in terms of communicating these new kind of themes to the people. So some good quotes there. For the film itself, it's set in a kind of fictional military barracks, which in itself can be this kind of metaphor for an oppressive environment. It's not really simplified.
I want to say one thing maybe. These that military barracks in that film is set in a kind of something what used to be former castle. And actually this happened in reality. They often kind of had these military barracks in something that were transformed castles, so that maybe that's not so sort of away from reality, but nevertheless, military barracks, because, as I told you in class, because there was compulsory military service in Eastern Europe. Wasn't like with the Americans, where everybody is proud of the army, and if you are a soldier, sort of everybody loves you. But in Eastern Europe, being a soldier, you had to go there for 2 years as a young man. Basically, it was slavery, and everybody hated it. So it was a metaphor for oppressive control. Yes.
Yeah, definitely. I think, like you were saying, with this kind of castle, where it's set anyway, it kind of goes into this fantasy element that the film has. And this is where, as you're saying, this still young men were kind of forced into, joining, enlisting in the army still, which is where we get this music teacher. He doesn't want to be there and escapes, where we get our event of the film where the soldiers' weapons are magically transformed into musical instruments. Initially, the soldiers are cautious of this. Turns into a liberating performance. It runs over 2 hours of art and romance and comedy.
And what is important is, in the first place, it's interesting that quite early, really in '64, they had this concept of celebrity and the media, and there happened to be 2 famous singers, right, that happened to be in the nearby spa, so that they actually added a kind of certain amount of glitz to it. And then the other interesting point, is there was this lady from the media who was supposed to report live on the unveiling of the Bach statue there or whatever, and so she suddenly it totally. This was so much like '68. Basically, this is what it was. In '68, suddenly everything was taken over by the free media, and even in '64, they were aware of it. How at the end of it in that film, she's saying, "Well, everywhere around me here, this is barbed wire. I would like to run towards you, but I would actually tear my clothes, and I'm afraid of barbed wire. But on the other hand, there is this other inventor of wireless communication, and I can actually speak to you. And this is brilliant." And of course, they were aware of what the media, how important free media really is.
So I'm just going to go into some of the social issues. There's a lot covered in this film. One of the ones I picked up on the most was this kind of generational divide. Because in the 1960s now we're seeing there's still this kind of generation of committed Stalinists who were there through, it being World War II, Stalinism itself, and were very kind of stuck in their ways and their ideals. We see this in the film with the kind of older generals who are trying to stop the music, who are trying to stop this liberation, versus this newer generation of younger people who don't have any personal memory of World War II and are kind of getting influenced by Western cultures and pop culture, and are turning to this, pop culture, jazz, rock, which we see obviously throughout the whole film. It's this creative frustration that they're still stuck in this censored world, or wanting to explore what other parts of the world are starting to dive into, which kind of links to that desire of freedom as well, which we've seen the Czech New Wave. It's we're moving away from state propaganda, more individual experience and freedom of expression as well. Big part as well is the gender dynamics that you can see in the film. It's still on surface level, there are still stereotypes in the way I think women are kind of represented in terms of they're the center of all romantic kind of plot lines, but then also they're about appearance, performance. But in the same way, it's still a lot more progressive than we've maybe seen before. Whereas, the presenter in this case is very much a focal leader of this whole show, which is kind of.
And she's a female, yeah. Okay,
yeah, it's quite independent and kind of. So it is a bit of two. I think it's moving more towards the progressive, which kind of shows what was going on in Czechoslovakia at this time in terms of views towards women. Kind of leads on as well to this celebrity fascination, which you were mentioning. With the, it's got celebrities in the film, with the, the singers, the presenter, which is again, this, they're idolized so much in the film with all the soldiers. reflecting this, younger generation's desire for creativity, and again, modern influence and glamour, personal freedom, which is, it's set in the barracks, and obviously these soldiers are so used to daily life. So yes, they're going to be idolizing these characters.
Mm-hmm.
You can kind of see that when the soldiers are like, I never thought I'd meet you. It's such a idolized escapism for them. They never thought they could actually meet these celebrities.
Yes.
It's contrasted with this great socialist environment. So it is again, fantasy to them, bringing into this kind of world that they're in. Just how people are seeking again this liberation, and when it's brought to them, it's almost not real. It's a big part of the film, I think. Again, some political issues mentioned again in with this transformation of what was happening. You've got de-Stalinism, which has been happening for a few years now, but it's still quite prominent. I've included a picture of the statue of Stalin in Prague because I thought it was quite interesting that it was only 2 years before this film came out that was demolished, which
it was really quite embarrassing that this was a sign of total sycophancy of the Czech communists. They kind of created this Stalin picture. They called it meat queue because there was also lack of meat, and you see Stalin and then his kind of followers behind it. But I mean, it was just about a couple of years when they finished. Then they needed to blow it up because, of course, it was discovered that Stalin was a criminal, right? So it was a joke,
it's
basically.
Expensive as well. I think a lot of people were annoyed at the fact that they could have
that
built a
base.
hospital or stuff.
It's on top of a hill overlooking Prague, and that base of it still is there, right? There apparently were some kind of, I don't know, vaults, whatever, or bomb shelters or whatever for the sort of I don't know, crème de la crème of the communist regime. But of course the top is away, and there's a kind of normal flat walking space there. But the kind of remnant of it still remains many decades later.
Yeah, I think I guess that also just shows how quickly people's perceptions and kind of ideas were changing.
Yes.
How easily they were influenced by what they were being told through the media. Suddenly, we don't like Stalin anymore. Let's remove this statue. As well, there's just a quote here that again is talking about how this was seen through these films. It's like from what we've seen before previously as well. They're bringing these representations of the horrors of Stalinism, but again, it's not so clear. Which is what we can kind of see in this and past films as well. Which links to the censorship as well that still very much cause this film to go towards fantasy, go towards that unclear way. I've added an example of an American folk singer, Pete Seeger, who did a tour he was touring and was kind of forced to remove a lot of anti-war songs from his performances, which shows how strict censorship still kind of was. The kind of Czechoslovakian government didn't want him. He did a lot of kind of Vietnam Wars, anti-war songs. Didn't want him to sing that because they're wary of how much publicity these ideas were given to their people. Which again, just kind of shows how this was in 1964 as well. So again, just showing how censorship is still very much present here. And again, like you were saying, this is kind of all in all a prelude to the Prague Spring, as this is so much pressure being put on the government, being put on people for this change, when you've got the young kind of generation battling against what's already set in stone, and with Western influence as well, this creativity and kind of freedom, which is
creativity and irony as well. And I mean, as I was saying, when we were seeing the film last week, we used to have this in a program here where there were in level 1 about 100 students, and I was worried, would sort of Scottish 17-year-olds be interested in something which takes longer than 2 hours and it's singing in a weird language, and they loved it because it has all this energy and kind of in a way irony, I would like to draw the attention to that, of course, because it's kind of also commercial, interesting. Commercialism is starting there. There has to be a love interest, right? So there is this bearded singer, Matushka, whatever, who falls in love with this allegedly, with this news reporter, and sort of invents this song or writes these sort of these words to what he says famous tune, Teresa. Jedině Teresa, only Teresa is the one who I'm love, whatever. And he sings it, and it's a good song, and it actually became like all those songs. This is also weird how kind of they became absolutely kind of like the Beatles, I suppose, in Britain. They became totally popular, and some of them still are to this very day. And yet then there is a scene in the film later when everybody goes to bed in that, and he still sings this song Teresa in front of her door with a guitar, and there's a danger of it falling into kind of kitsch and sentimentality, and yet all the other sort of soldiers open the other doors and make fun of it, so they kind of immediately kind of destroy any possibility of sentimentality and kitsch. So that this is also what actually gives it energy to drive forward, maybe, I think. Okay?
Yeah, I think what I was going to say again about that kind of celebrity, like it's that entertainment now and that pop culture, like it's not just the celebrity characters. They were actual actors who were big pop stars at the time. So I think showing what kind of cinema, what people were wanting to see at the time in the country.
And also there is this other thing which is interesting, that obviously in an army you've got all the soldiers as weapons. They turn through Bach into musical instruments, but of course there were only some musicians in that unit. And of course there were also sort of rank and file soldiers who just suddenly all had violins but didn't know what to do with them. And there's another little joke there where there is this bloke who kind of puts them into a kind of classroom, 100 or whatever soldiers with violin, and teaches them, and they just do da da da. This is all they learn and to play. And then this kind of organizer says, well, what have you learned? And they play these three notes. And he says, go on. And they say, well, that's it. And they play it all over again. And then, unfortunately, I had to push it on, so this little scene we didn't play last Wednesday. But when at the end, when it's a part of this television program, when sort of Matushka is singing Teresa, only Teresa, they incorporated this 100 of violin players into it, and at one point in that song they go da 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 repeatedly. So that this is another joke. It's based on jokes, basically. It's quite that's quite attractive, I think. Anyway.
So yeah, another little bit about media as well, since that's kind of the main theme that we see through this film. There was this new kind of desire for these democratic past traditions that we had before, to just reinfuse socialism in a slightly different way. Also, we've got film, but we had magazine, newspapers as well. This one, the Bar, I think that's how you say that, was a kind of young, kind of art and social magazine where young authors were writing about political things, art, fashion, just a way of getting kind of information around and kind of have this revolution from the young generation as well. Theatre as well. You're seeing a lot more in this kind of smaller theatres, non-traditional, these themes that were considered inappropriate, things about freedom, liberation. So it's kind of trying to gather force for this kind of liberation that we're seeing. This quote here is just about how it's the information that the government could not control. It's trying to reach the public, inform them of changes that were happening elsewhere, as well as I was saying, the other influence as well. And then, so for the film itself, obviously film is a big kind of form of media that we're seeing this through. And I think just having the TV crew itself in the film as well is kind of like this metaphor for how the media and state were very interlinked, and they were kind of working with and against each other to kind of, as acts of resistance, but they were quite influential of each other.
Yes, about this media, I would like to say one. If you look at the map, Czech Republic is a kind of, or almost a circle, whatever, which is kind of within, well, sticks into Germany, and so Germany is to the west of it, and to the south of it is Austria. And it's not a huge country, maybe it's whatever, 200-300 miles across. And of course, even under communism, after the invasion in the 70s, where there was all censorship, you could see West German television on probably about 40 or 50% of the Czech territory, right? Yes, of course, it was in German, but nevertheless, and Austrian television in the south, West German television in the west. So basically, I suppose if you have access to a sort of German television all the time in your home, you just switch it over on your TV set. You would kind of learn a little bit German over those years. Or if there was any news about, say, subversion in Czechoslovakia, you would see it quite freely. This was a very frustrating kind of situation for the regime. It wasn't like Russia, which was somewhere far in the east, where obviously you didn't have any direct impact of Western media, but certainly you had Western television in much of Czechoslovakia under communism. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you can definitely see that. Obviously, this time we've got a lot more people watching TV as well,
yes.
And there's more kind of content there. Also, I guess you can see that in the presenter as well, who was told to film a certain thing is filming the music instead. You can see how they were kind of getting ideas across. So final scene, I think, kind of is important because you are kind of the whole 2 hours in the middle is, a fantasy performance. This final scene draws you back into kind of reality in a way when the music teacher is, getting attacked and Bach whispers, "Defend yourself." Violin turns in the machine gun and he uses this to shoot at his oppressors. I think I think a lot of people were surprised at this ending, but after this musical extravaganza, the characters in some way, they've been liberated by music, they've matured in their ideals, everyone's kind of brought together in this way. So, it's an encouragement to fight against the communist regime and embrace art.
Yeah, it is remarkable, and basically it says you become mature through culture, but nevertheless there's a point where you have to drop your musical instruments and defend yourself, which is really absolutely. I don't understand how they could have got away with it in '64, but nevertheless.
It can't all just be this joyful kind of performance when there is still war.
Well, it was those commanders who attacked that music teacher at the end of the film. Yeah.
Which it's kind of showing you need to fight against this older generation are still stuck in these kind of ideas in a way. Again, this prelude to the Prague Spring, where there's so much kind of pressure from people now to move in a different direction and kind of reform. So just some concluding statements. It is very much an anti-war film, even if it does kind of hide a lot of that through art and performance. When you look at it and you look at the songs, you look at what it's saying in as a whole. It's rejecting militarization of youth and this glorification of conflict that we'd seen previously in the years. All in all, it's a celebration of creativity, it's freedom and emotional expression. Again, this critique of authoritarian structures and just how absurd war is. So a little statement at the end here. Through humor, music, and imagination, the film critiques the political and social issues present in 1960s Czechoslovakia, a period of significant change and liberation. And then we'll go through there. And that's it.
Well, thank you very much again. As usual, all of you do these presentations brilliantly. I have to sort of congratulate you. It was very good. Thank you very much. And again, for everyone, if you want to have a look at the PowerPoint, it is on Moodle. Thank you. Anybody has any questions or comments, criticism? And in which case, I will now briefly tell you about tomorrow's film. And this is the last film. You've closed it. Okay, right, damn it.
Oh, sorry.
What do we need to do again? Okay, it'll ask me again for that. Maybe not, because I will see. Yes, it does. So anyway, okay. So there's stuff on Moodle, but I'll talk off the cuff about it. It's a film by Jaromír Jireš based on an absolutely classical work by or novel by Milan Kundera, which is called The Joke, and it was published in 1967. The film was made in 1968. The film is slightly simpler than the novel, because the novel is based on sort of a contrast of different accounts by different protagonists, and each of them are slightly different, so that there's a plurality. And of course, you can't do this in this linear film. The book and the film, I suppose, were an absolute landmark for basically the end of communism. It was sort of feted or praised by especially Western commentators as a total condemnation of Stalinism. Kundera was irritated by it and made a kind of frivolous remark, which is often quoted now in the later editions of this novel. Sort of, give me peace. This is not about Stalinism. This is a love story, he says. No, it's not. It's absolutely, well, he was just being cheeky, but nevertheless. The novel, as well as the film, are a brilliant kind of analysis of what happens under Stalinism, and it's a condemnation of Stalinism. But at the same time, really, the more general meaning of the film is, and this is again like, typical of the films of the 60s, it kind of had relevance beyond communism. It is a film about the insufficiency of the human brain. The main hero, the hero of the film, is originally a student under Stalinism in Prague, in Czechoslovakia. His name is Ludvík Jahn. And as a young man, Kundera's novels are often about sex or short stories. He uses sex quite a lot because he kind of thinks that in sexual situations, but basically kind of absolutely fundamental characteristics of human beings can be sort of shown or manifested. So he's sort of trying to go out with a girlfriend, fellow student, and she doesn't want to sleep with him because she's a kind of ardent Stalinist communist, and rather than he wants to invite her to spend some days with him in a friend's cottage or whatever, and she says, I'm actually going to this wonderful political Marxist training instead, and she sends him this sort of letter or postcard saying, oh, it's wonderful, we are learning about optimism here and all that, and she's absolutely stupid. And he's sexually frustrated, and he sends her a postcard saying, basically making fun of it, saying optimism is rubbish and long live Trotsky. She was writing to him that they were learning about how Trotsky was incredibly terrible, that this is a kind of evil character in the communist kind of history. And he says there, long live Trotsky. You know, what she does, she shows that postcards to the sort of student union, communists of course, and they expel him from university and send him to the mines to do manual work for 6 years. Basically, they destroy his potential career. And of course, the film is taking place in the 60s, which are much more liberal. And this Ludvík Jahn, from the very beginning, absolutely prides himself on how incredibly intellectual he is. And he's basically this male arrogant bloke. And in fact, the whole novel and film is a study of human insufficiency. He is absolutely okay. So I think a normal person would know that the communist regime will actually take revenge if you send a postcard saying optimism is rubbish and long live Trotsky. that he could have actually thought about that. Normal people didn't actually send open postcards like that in Stalinism anyway. And generally he makes these assumptions about everybody, but he absolutely don't have any social understanding of anything. And of course, after he's expelled from university, of course the regime is nasty, and under normal situation they wouldn't destroy people's careers like that. But nevertheless, he kind of doesn't understand what society he's in, he doesn't understand people, and he's obsessed then with revenge, and he takes one of his fellow students, his name was Zemanek, kind of was instrumental. He was a very sort of active communist at university, and it was instrumental for actually expelling Ludwig from the university. And many years in the liberal 60s, Zemanek's wife comes to do an interview with him. He works in some kind of research institute, and he realizes that she's Zemanek's wife, and he sort of invents this kind of revenge, which is really quite disgusting as well, because he puts to seduce her, thereby damage Mr. Zemanek, right? And that, I would argue, like when there was this war in Yugoslavia, when Yugoslavia fell to bits in the 1990s, Serbians fought Croatians or whatever, and there was this thing that sort of Serbian soldiers would pride themselves on raping the wives or girlfriends of the soldiers on the other side, and there was this kind of incredible kind of Eastern or Balkan or whatever thing that actually, if you actually rape somebody's partner or wife, you kind of damage the property of the man, right? And kind of this kind of very disgusting and nasty thing is kind of slightly, you can feel it in sort of this Ludwig's decision to kind of revenge himself on Zemanek by actually sleeping with his wife. But unfortunately, what has happened, the world has moved on. You can't step in the same river twice. Mr. Zemanek, who was an ardent Stalinist in the 50s, is now a reformist communist. He makes lectures about Stalin's crimes. He's absolutely loved by his students. He's a reformist. Ludwig Kahn discovers it, horror, that he's on his side, and he has actually repudiated his wife, and he has a sort of female student of his as a new girlfriend. So he's actually very happy that actually Ludwig has seduced his aging wife. So anyway, this is just a few words about Milan Kundera. I would say that the joke, which of course refers to that postcard, is kind of joke that God has sort of made on us. God as some kind of sort of nasty sort of creature, deliberately created us with very insufficient brains. The natural reality is incredibly complicated, and we with our little idiotic brains can't really properly ever understand it and are making mistakes. And one other thing which Kundera says somewhere else in another of his novel, Einmal ist keinmal, what happens only once is as though it has not happened ever. Basically, we only are given one chance, one life, and if we bugger it, we can't do anything about it. So it's a kind of primarily, in general terms, this kind of criticism of human mind's insufficiency, and I think this was motivated by the fact that Kundera, as a young man, he was born in 1929, so in 48 he would have been, the communist takeover, he would have been 19. In the early years of communism, Stalinism, like many other people, he was an absolutely enthusiastic communist, and he couldn't kind of live this down for the rest of his life. And basically he later on cursed himself, what an idiot I was. He became quite a reformist communist, obviously, in the 60s. After the Soviet invasion, he was banned. Then in about 74 or whatever, he was offered a chance to go and teach at a French university. So the Czechoslovak regime had this policy of actually expelling people whom they didn't like. So from about 75, Kundera lived in France and wrote. It's quite interesting because he wrote this novel, Farewell Waltz, before he left Czechoslovakia in 75, and he thought, this is again shows you how little perception he's had. He basically thought, oh, this is going to be my last novel because it will never ever be published because I'm censored in Czechoslovakia, never be ever be published in Czech, and of course that's the end of my career as a writer. In fact, he went to France and became one of the most important French writers. Book of Laughter and Forgetting, The Unbearable Lightness of Being this is before your time now, he's again forgotten because this was in the 80s, 70s, 80s. But was a famous film, a French film, you know, so he's now called French Czech author or maybe even French author. So no, he was a major figure, and obviously you could see that even though he was frustrated with his own, as he would call it, idiocy, there is this film, and come and see it tomorrow. That is all. Any comments? Okay. Well, let's hope my head hasn't been cut off there, but nevertheless, there we are. Okay. It still recorded itself.